Welcome to Nobilis Erotica, the best science fiction and fantasy erotica podcast in the known universe. This week's story, A Succubus and Her Lover. This is episode 446. I am your host, Nobilis Reed. This episode of Nobilis Erotica is sponsored by the generous patronage of Nobilis Erotica listeners and Ariok Morningstar in particular. He signed up for the $100 command performance level a few months back. I wrote a story, got a narrator, and we're bringing that to you today. This is one of the greatest pleasures that I get out of doing this is when somebody says, hey, I like your writing so much. Here's a pile of money. Go make me something. And it's beautiful. If you'd like to do this, go to patreon.com/Nobilis and pledge at the $100 level. You only have to do it for 1 month and you get a story made to your order. But hey, if that's a little too pricey for you, there are lower levels all the way down to $1 where you can help paying the normal everyday episodes. This story is titled In the Arms of the Deep. Our narrator, returning this month, is Joanna Bennett, a professional actor, theater educator, singer, budding voice actress, and occasional burlesque dancer hailing from the Midwest. In her regional theater exploits, she has been known to play anything from witches, gargoyles, dragons, evil sorceresses, and even the occasional mortal male or female when pressed. When not on stage, she can be found haunting coffee shops and dog parks with her aging Welsh corgi, jamming to Swedish occult metal on her headphones, usually with a bit of fantasy smut in hand. Here we go.
In the Arms of the Deep by Nobilis Reed. Onoskelia opened her eyes to a sight she had not expected. She didn't need to sleep, of course, but if there was nothing happening, she could suspend her consciousness to put off boredom, and, trapped as she was, the ability had served her well. Normally there was nothing to see, as the tower room had no windows and often had no light sources whatsoever. Silence ruled very nearly all the time. Even the bed she lay upon was nothing particularly special, a simple mattress with an embroidered spread over it. Strangers never came. Not until today. The figure silhouetted in torchlight at the entrance to the chamber wasn't the lanky, bearded, robed sorcerer Kathuk. This time, it was a broad-chested man in gleaming armor, bloody sword in one hand, shield strapped to one arm. "What manner of creature are you?" he demanded, raising his blade to gesture at her furred legs, most importantly the cloven hooves that served her for feet. She mentally cursed Kathuk for not leaving her with enough essence to fuel even an illusion to cloak her true nature, much less a shapeshift. There was nothing for it but to fall back on deceit. "A slave of the sorcerer. May his name be spat by angels. Curse with this shape to keep me from running away. If I were to return home, my village would slay me as an abomination." The knight strode up to the edge of the circular bed and eyed the runes and sigils embroidered into the sheet. "I have slain 12 demonic servants of Kathuk today. Why should I not believe you are the 13th? He wiped his blade on the linens, alas, not obscuring any of the imprisoning marks. "If I were a demon, would I not have returned to the abyss when you slew my master?" "Maybe. Or maybe you are a demon, bound here to sate the sorcerer's lust." Rather than speak the thought that immediately came to mind, "If only," Onoskelia said, "he slaked his thirst from me. That is true. But I am human. You must believe me." She sat up and put her hands together prayerfully, giving him the most helpless expression. If the shape of her legs had permitted it, she would have kneeled. The knight sheathed his sword and raised his visor on his helm, revealing a face where battle scars warred with a lustful sneer for which would be the ugliest. "Lying wench," he growled. "God's damned sorcerer hasn't had 2 pennies worth of pillage to pay for my service and gutting the old bastard, so I'm going to take my spoils here." He shucked his gauntlets and undid a buckle at his waist that loosened a piece of armor from over his crotch. Lust radiated from him like heat from a bonfire. No, please!" Onoskelia scrambled away from him, holding an arm up between them. Her face showed fear, but underneath, her demonic heart sang with anticipation. "Don't you knights swear oaths to protect the innocent?" His hand lashed out, grabbing her ankle, dragging her back toward him as he crawled up onto the bed. "Aye, but I'll be damned if you're an innocent." The armor plate he cast aside revealed a furious erection, bobbing as he dragged her toward him and spread her furred goat legs. She struggled, but her hooves bounced off his breastplate, and the kicks only served to make him grin even wider. He thrust into her without hesitation, and she screamed. Inwardly, she sighed in disgust. This callous, ignorant, oath-breaking knight had signed his own death warrant, and there was nothing she could do about it. Her demonic nature embraced him, welcoming his aura as his life force began to drain into her body. At first, it was just a trickle, but it was enough to ignite her magic powers. With the merest flicker of energies, her full glory manifested, sprouting broad wings of blood-red feathers, each one tinged at the end with soot and pinpricks of embers. Twisted, sharp horns sprouted from her forehead, and her teeth lengthened into predatory points. The knight, rather than recognizing the trouble he was in, grinned even wider. "Aha! I knew it!" He slammed his body into hers, chuckling. "Never fucked a demoness before. The boys in the Adventurers Guild will love this one." "You poor fool," she said, in a voice full of regret. Her claws dug into his pauldrons, pulling him close, the strength in her arms far beyond what his mortal muscles could resist. "Hell's below," he shouted. But he was powerless to escape her grip, or even to stop fucking her. His body continued thrusting, even as an expression of horror spread on his face. "What are you doing to me?" "Poor, ignorant fool," said Onoskelia. "You did it to yourself." She could now hold him in place with one arm around his shoulders, so she stroked his face with the other hand. Gently, she removed his helmet, then his gorget, leaving his head and neck fully exposed. She pulled him down and kissed his mouth, even as he gasped for air, his thrusts turning into spasms and his weight falling more and more onto her body. His moan of orgasm trailed off into a death rattle. With a deep sigh, she pushed his lifeless body off her. "Mortals," she muttered, exerting a tiny fraction of her power to clean the residue of his spending from her body. The wards around the bed were as strong as ever, but she was now at the pinnacle of her power. She took hold of the fabric within the circle, dug into it with her claws, and gave a mighty wrench. A great rent appeared between her hands, spreading toward the ring of runes and sigils at the edge. It paused, the embroidery flaring up bright blue as it resisted her power. Onoskelia redoubled her efforts, backing up the supernatural strength of her limbs with demonic magic. The stitches flared eye-searingly bright, and then there was a pop, and then the circle went dark. She was free. Triumphant, she strode off the bed. Freedom! At last! After so many years bound within that circle, it felt marvelous simply to walk on a solid floor, going where she pleased. At first, her thought was to return to the nether realms where she was created. It was home, and she could hear its call. Instinctively, she took hold of that summons, pulled on it. And nothing happened. She had used that magic 1,000 times to go back and forth to the abyss, and it had never failed to work. She pulled again, harder. Nothing. Was there some lingering effect of the binding still in effect? She did a quick mental self-assessment. There was something there, something left behind, a kind of wall. She poked at it. It broke open, like a dam bursting, no, like a burning house collapsing or an avalanche letting loose. That bastard. Not only had the sorcerer bound her body, he had bound her mind, ordered her to forget huge chunks of her past. If she had known, if she had remembered, she would have screamed his tower down with her anguish, which was no doubt why he had done it to her. Without a second thought, she leapt out the window, spread her wings, and took flight. Her destination wasn't the abyss. The tower and the brooding mountains where it stood quickly fell behind as Onoskelia raced toward the west, following the setting sun toward the storm-tossed ocean. She soared over forest and meadow, startling a group of farmers returning to their village from their fields. They pointed and shouted at this winged, naked woman overhead, then rushed in the direction of their little church. "Fear not," she wanted to say. "I'm not hungry today. If I had wanted you, I'd already have had you." But there was no time. The village was past her before the thought was even fully formed. By the time she reached the shore, the sun had set, followed soon after by a crescent moon. Even so, starlight was enough for her to see the spires of rock jutting out of the sea that marked the gates of her destination. Gleefully, she dove into the ocean, using her wings now to propel her along the ocean floor rather than through the air. She passed coral clumps which would have been brilliantly colorful had there been any light, and a shipwreck which would have been gloomily spooky if the succubus had any fear of the dark. After a time, she came to a winding path, not on the seafloor itself, but of luminescent globes every 20 or 30 yards that grew on thick stalks from the ocean floor. She wound between them, her lithe body as graceful in the depths as it was in the air. The darkness and emptiness of her swim gave Onoskelia time to think. She had been trapped in the sorcerer's tower for many years. What had changed in her absence? Would she be welcomed? Would she even be recognized? The thought was silly, but it had been so long. The trail of lights dove over the edge of an immense undersea crevasse, stretching down into almost unimaginable depths. The coral and schools of fish quickly gave way to bare rock and a few scattered anemones and crustaceans. Had it always taken this long to get to the depths? I must be out of practice, the succubus thought. Only mortals degrade for lack of exercise. Finally, the orbs ended at the wide maw of an undersea cave, its interior lit by schools of luminescent fish that drifted like nebula in the blackness. And there, floating in the center, was Brolutha. She was beautiful. From a roughly spherical body extended long, sinuous, graceful arms, their tendril tips flitting among the schools of colorful fish, prompting splashes of colorful light. The silent visual orchestra danced and shone in fanciful patterns until a huge eye, the color of amethyst, turned and focused on Onoskelia. She stopped, extending her wings to arrest her rush. 5 beats of her demonic heart thumped out doubt and grief. It had been so long. Had things changed? Would she still be welcome? Had another taken her place? Why wasn't she saying anything?
The legs.
The name echoed in the cave, spoken not in the thin, hissing speech of surface dwellers, but in the whistles, clicks, thuds, and rumbles of ocean dwellers. It had started as an insult, a reminder of all the ways she was different. But it had become a token of endearment as their relationship had blossomed. So long ago. Did it still mean what it did?
My love.
With a great thrust of her wings, Onoskelia darted into the sea monster's arms, instantly enveloped by the thick ropes of muscular flesh that wrapped about her limbs and torso with gentle power. Suckers kissed her body in 1,000 places, the sharp ridges that could rend the flesh from an orca held in abeyance.
I have missed you.
Onoskelia's voice felt small next to the power of her lover's intonations. I am so sorry. I was trapped, tricked by a human sorcerer. He bound me in his tower, drowned my power for his own magic. I couldn't get away. I couldn't even call for help. The arm squeezed briefly, a gesture of comfort and protection.
Tell me everything, or nothing, if that is your wish.
The succubus let it out. She let it all out, from her hunting expedition in the city, a girl's gotta eat after all, and being ambushed in the city, all the way to finding herself unable to return to the nether plains. Patiently, the monster held her while she told it, offering only the occasional or
Oh.
in sympathy or encouragement. Why couldn't I get back to the nether realms? Not that I want to, not once I remembered you, but it bothers me that I couldn't get back. Did the sorcerer do something to me? Does some scrap of his binding remain?
You learned, my love,
Said the monster.
you are no longer fit for the nether realms.
Are you saying I did this to myself?
In a way, I did it to you. Before your unjust incarceration, I taught you love, and from that you learned pity. Even as you granted that horrible mortal the justice he deserved, you understood that he had made himself not a monster, but a pitiable wretch.
Onoskelia wrapped her arms around one of the thickest tentacles. Then I can never go back. The arm squeezed her again.
You will always have a home here, for as long as you wish it.
I know. Even as a demon, even an exiled one, Onoskelia had no need for light or food or even air. There was only one thing she needed. My love, would you...
Yes,
fuck me?
of course.
The arms shifted, their musculature rippling along her skin as the thin tips encircled Onoskelia's breasts, wrapped around her thighs, immobilized her arms, and slid into her mouth. More arms held her wings, gently, splayed out from her body, allowing them to twitch and thrash, but never letting go. The multitudinous caresses, in a moment, went from gently caring to undeniably erotic. The succubus allowed herself to become lost in the sensations, giving up the worries, letting go of the memories, and reveling in the myriad of sensations her lover evoked. Nothing mattered here. Nothing intruded. Here in the depths of her lover's cave, lit only by the constellations of glowing fish, the sea monster's touch became even more intimate, shifting to more sensitive places, leaving hundreds of sucker kisses behind as they moved to new flesh. The arms were incredibly versatile, with delicate dexterity at their tips that transformed to muscular power closer to her body. Thick ropes of flesh were wrapped around her breasts, causing them to form distended domes where the delicate tentacle tips flicked and squeezed. The ones wrapped around her thighs played with her vulva and anus, wriggling their way inside, filling her with firm, pulsing flesh. It had been so long, so very long. The supernatural hunger for mortal life force had been sated, but the hunger for touch, for loving, caring touch, had not, and the depth of it burned like a volcano. Onoskelia's lover poured the depths of the sea into that volcano, hardening it. The interaction building layer upon layer until it burst up into the air. The demoness's scream of ecstasy was the exultant explosion of a new island, beautiful and terrible. Onoskelia's orgasmic shout echoed in the cave, causing the fish to shelter behind outcrops and coral, leaving her alone with her chthonic lover in complete darkness. Her arms and legs freed, she wrapped her body around one of the monster's thick arms, cuddling close. "Thank you," she said, running her fingers across the firm flesh. There was no need for reciprocity. Such things were for mortals. This was not an exchange. It was a gift, and one that Onoskelia appreciated deeper than words could convey. She had no need for sleep, any more than she did for air, but it was a pleasure to relax and bask in her lover's embrace. She would need to return to the surface before too long to find some mortal whose soul had been corrupted deeply enough to be vulnerable to her in order to feed. She wasn't sure how she was going to feel about that. Would this strange emotion, this pity, be a problem? The monster stroked her back between her wings. It was a question that could wait for another day.
And that's our story. Over on the Patreon campaign this month, we're welcoming 3 new supporters: Casey, Will X, and Brandon. In addition to my abiding gratitude, starting in September, Patreon supporters will be receiving 2 chapters a month of the 3rd volume of the Monster Whisperer series, titled Monster Whisperer 3rd Person. The first book of this series is currently available on Audible, and the second, Monster Whisperer 2nd Class, will be coming later this year. Now is a great time to start supporting the podcast. We've got some excellent stuff coming your way. You have been listening to the Nobilis Erotica podcast. Theme music is composed and performed by Mass Relay. This podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Until next time, listen hard.